shit sucks, what to do about it.
So,
Don't just throw
in
it
this
away.
ongoing conversation about how shit is fucked, a lot of us turn to talking about root causes. And many folks say, well, the problem is just that people are all greedy. And on the heels of that, there comes the solution to that problem, which is the planet will be better off without us. Or maybe a slightly modified solution will be something like, we just need to get rid of all the greedy people. Now, it's true that people are greedy. You're greedy, I'm greedy. We're all capable of being very greedy. We're greedy and we're generous, we're mean, we're kind, we're selfish, selfless, smart, stupid, gentle, pushy, grumpy, cheerful. Human beings have a wide range of emotions and behaviors. But the folks who sum up the problems we face as being one of greed speak as though this particular variety of planet-devouring greed that we're all witnessing is in our DNA, that there's nothing that can be done about it. But this destructive greed isn't located in our human beingness. This destructive greed is located in our culture. Let's just look at it for a moment. If the problem really is that people are fundamentally greedy, then how did all those fundamentally greedy human beings thrive for 99% of human existence without destroying themselves the way that civilized cultures do so well and so rapidly? And how do indigenous cultures today thrive without any obvious manifestations of greed? Our culture, this world-devouring culture called industrial civilization, encourages greed. It nurtures greed in its citizens. It has to, because at its basis it values power and profit and production over the health of the people on the earth. And that means that the good citizens, the most successful and the most popular people in our culture, will be the greediest of all. To quote a ZZZ 3333 lyric, we're trained from birth to search for greed. Suddenly it's so plain to see it's within me and everyone I meet. Now, I know in my personal life, inside of civilization, I can think of many times when I've been strongly criticized and ridiculed for being too generous, for being a soft touch, or for giving when it seemed to be no obvious immediate payback or obvious exchange. And I can also think of many times when I've been coached to be greedy, although it was usually couched in terms like, it's a dog-eat-dog world, or you have to look out for number one, or you can't help people, they have to help themselves, that kind of thing. But I can't recall a single time that I was really criticized for being too greedy. And then by comparison, I think about Malidoma Patrice Sommet, who grew up among the Dagara people, a people our culture would say have nothing, even though I might argue they have everything. And he said that his mother frequently disciplined him for being too greedy. That was his number one memory of her. He was born into a culture that values sharing. I was born into a culture that values hoarding. So he was trained to be generous, and I was trained to be greedy. And in our society, it's pretty easy to see that greed propels people really rapidly to the top of the socioeconomic ladder. Now, of course, we don't call it greed. We call it ambition, or drive, or self-interest. But really, who are we fooling?
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
So in our culture, people like Henry Kravis, Jack Abramoff, Donald Trump, Dick Cheney rise quickly to the top of the ladder to nowhere. Now, some of us might call these guys bad guys. They're the so-called evil politicians and evil CEOs. But according to the guidelines of our culture, they are very, very good boys. They're doing exactly what they've been taught to do. Now, if those same bad guys had been born into indigenous communities, they might still not be the most pleasant people to be around, but they certainly wouldn't be able to inflict this tragic and immeasurable amounts of culturally sanctioned harm that we've seen perpetrated in the name of freedom and progress. So, a culture like ours, based on isolation, individualism, profit, production, hoarding of wealth at the expense of all other life, will naturally encourage greed. And as Daniel Quinn says, we're a culture that is fundamentally based on greed, but if you look outside of our culture, that isn't the case.
A culture that is very fundamentally based on greed, but if you look outside of our culture, that isn't the case.
Indeed. If human beings who can be greedy and generous and mean and kind and selfish and selfless and smart and stupid, grumpy, cheerful, if they're born into a culture that values the well-being of the people and the earth above all, the most successful people will be the most generous. There's no difference between the people. We're all human, but there is a major difference between the cultures. The leaders of indigenous tribes are marked by their lack of possessions, not their stockpiles of wealth. They give everything away. They're honored for their humility and their ability to listen, not for their pride and their ability to dominate. When one tribal leader was told to order his people to comply, he said, "If I tell them what to do, I will no longer be their leader." Indigenous cultures are based on the well-being of the group, and they naturally encourage sharing. There's no ladder to nowhere. There's no reward for greedy behavior. In fact, greed is strongly discouraged, so people develop other aspects of their character like generosity, playfulness, that ensure their success in their culture. Now, Jerry Mander tells a story about the Penang people in Indonesia who were on trial for blocking this bridge that the lumber trucks were using to tear up the rainforest. And he wrote, "During the trial it became clear that they didn't understand the concept of crime because apparently they didn't have crime. They were asked to give an example in their society of an act that others would disapprove of. They had a little huddle and discussed it, and then said that if someone doesn't openly share what they had, he or she would meet with disapproval. That was the only crime they could think of." And Mander went on to say after that, "So I have to reject the idea that selfishness is instinctive. It's come to be understood that selfishness is part of human nature, but I think that's in the context of the lives that we have now. We are so isolated that we tend to act only in our own self-interest." And finally, I just want to add that even in industrial civilization, the problem isn't that people are greedy, but it's that some people, what Thomas Jefferson called wolves, are very greedy. Greed seems to feed upon itself, as we've probably all witnessed in ourselves and others. Perhaps that is the wisdom that indigenous leaders have been passing on for centuries, because they know that a culture that is based on greed is a culture that destroys life.